The morning fog had not yet lifted from the low ground when Clara Voss set the ledger on the auctioneer's table in full view of every rancher, banker, and curious townsperson who had crowded into the feed barn on the edge of Harmon County, and the number written there in her steady hand was not the number Aldous Whitmore had expected to see. He stood 3 feet from her, this large man in a wool coat that cost more than most families in that room spent on groceries in a winter, and his face had gone the particular color that comes to powerful men when the arithmetic stops working in their favor. His jaw was set, his hands were very still at his sides, but his eyes moved, and they moved the way eyes move when a person is privately recalculating and does not like what the recalculation tells them. Clara herself did not fidget. She did not look at him. She looked at the ledger, then at the auctioneer, and she waited with the particular patience of someone who has had a great deal of practice waiting in rooms where the air was hostile, and the outcome uncertain. Everyone in that barn knew they were watching something that would be talked about for a generation. Not one of them could have told you 3 years earlier that it would be Clara Voss at the center of it. 3 years earlier, most of them had agreed quietly among themselves that Clara Voss had lost her mind. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? 3 years before that morning in the feed barn, in the last weak light of a November afternoon, Clara Voss had stood at the edge of 60 acres of reed marsh in the low crescent of land where Harmon County's eastern reach dipped toward the river basin, and she had paid $2 an acre for the privilege of owning it. $120 total, which the county land office accepted with the mild bewilderment of clerks who have seen eccentric transactions before, but rarely ones quite so cheerfully eccentric as this. The 60 acres had been on the county tax rolls as uncollectible nuisance land for 11 years. The back taxes, long since written to a separate ledger, the county preferred not to discuss. It flooded in spring. It bred mosquitoes in summer. The reeds grew 12 feet tall in places, dense as a wall, and the ground beneath them was the kind of soft, dark muck that swallowed a fence post whole if you did not set it in gravel. 3 separate buyers had walked the perimeter in the years prior and walked away shaking their heads. One of them, a cattleman named Burl, who ran 400 head of Hereford on the upland just north of the Crescent, had said publicly that the county ought to pay someone to take the parcel rather than the other way around. Aldous Whitmore, who held the largest operating note at the only bank within 40 miles, had offered the county $18 for it in a moment he later described as charitable impulse, and the county had declined because $18 was technically less than the back taxes owed. So it sat, and it flooded, and the reeds grew, and Clara Voss, 41 years old, recently widowed, recently relocated from the city where she had spent 17 years doing restoration work on degraded wetland systems for a state environmental agency, looked at those 60 acres and saw something no one else in Harmon County had the training or the inclination to see. She had come to the county for a reason that had nothing to do with the marsh. She had come because her husband, a quiet school teacher named Martin, had grown up on a small plot of ground 12 miles west of the Reed Crescent, and had always intended to return to it when his health allowed. His health had not allowed. He had died in March of that year, 44 years old, from a cardiac event so swift and so final that Clara had stood in the hospital corridor afterward with the feeling that the world had simply skipped a page. She was not a woman who invited pity, and she did not receive it gracefully when it arrived uninvited, but she was also not a woman who pretended that grief was anything other than what it was, a long, slow tax on the ordinary. She sold the city apartment. She came to Harmon County. She bought the 12 acres Martin had inherited, but never worked, which sat on a gentle rise above the lowland, and contained a farmhouse that needed its roof repaired, a shallow well that needed its pump replaced, and a small barn that was structurally sound but cosmetically discouraging. She fixed the roof. She fixed the pump. She whitewashed the barn. And then, in September of that year, she walked east on the county road that bisected the flat ground below the rise, and she found the 60 reed-choked acres that would consume the next several years of her life, and in doing so would reshape the economic life of the county in ways that none of the confident men who stood around the margins of that November transaction could have foreseen or would, for a long time, acknowledge. The person who helped her understand what she was looking at was an old man named Theodore, who had emigrated from the Eastern European lowlands 50 years prior, and who lived in a small painted house at the south end of the county road, directly across from the Reed Crescent's widest edge. Theodore was 81 years old, spare and deliberate, with the kind of patience that accumulates in people who have spent their entire adult lives working biological systems that operate on timescales longer than a human career. He had been a reed cutter and a sedge farmer in the old country, in the great flat basins where wetland cultivation was not a curiosity but a livelihood stretching back 4 centuries. He had come to Harmon County because his daughter lived here, and his daughter had eventually moved to the city, and Theodore had stayed because he was 81 years old, and the painted house suited him, and because, he told Clara when she first knocked on his door to ask what he knew about the low ground, he had been watching those 60 acres for 30 years and had his own ideas about what was in them. He invited her in. He made tea in a pot that had clearly been making tea for decades. He sat across from her at a painted table and told her what he had observed from his porch across the road over 30 years of watching seasons move through the crescent. He told her about the particular species of reed that dominated the eastern section, which was not the coarse, invasive variety that most people assumed, but was in fact a heritage stand with deep established root systems, the kind that, properly harvested and managed, produced a specific grade of material used in acoustic instrument manufacturing and high-quality thatching. He told her about the sedge margins along the western edge, where the ground rose slightly and the water moved through in thin braided channels before disappearing into the old drainage tile that the county had installed in 1952 and never maintained. He told her that the soil beneath the reed canopy, the dark anaerobic muck that everyone found so off-putting, was in fact a 30-year accumulation of decomposed organic matter that, once the hydrology was properly managed, would be among the most fertile growing medium in the county. He told her all of this in the clipped, accented sentences of a man who does not waste words, and then he set down his cup and looked at her steadily and said the sentence that she would hear again and again in her own memory over the years that followed. He said, "The crack in the vessel is not the flaw. It is how the water found its way in." Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she asked him how long it would take to restore the hydrology. He said 2 growing seasons if the tile work was addressed promptly, and the reed harvest was timed correctly. She asked him if he would help her. He said he had been hoping someone would ask. The community's reaction to her purchase of the 60 acres was, in the charitable interpretation, skeptical. In the less charitable interpretation, which was the more accurate one, it was openly derisive. The word that circulated most frequently in the months after she filed the deed was foolish, and it was applied with the particular warmth that small communities reserve for people whose folly reflects a type of outsider naivety they find both predictable and entertaining. Burl the cattleman told 3 different people at the hardware store in December that he had tried to warn her, which was not true. He had said nothing to her directly, but the retelling improved with each iteration. The loan officer at Whitmore's bank, a thin-lipped man named Garrett, who processed Clara's small operating account with barely concealed condescension, told her in December that she was welcome to apply for a drainage improvement loan, but that the collateral value of the 60 acres was functionally zero, and the bank's enthusiasm for the project was correspondingly limited. She thanked him and did not apply. She had savings. $11,400, which she had accumulated over 17 years of careful, unglamorous living. She had a pension from the State Environmental Agency, modest but regular, and she had in Theodore a partner whose knowledge was worth considerably more than his willingness to accept no payment beyond the occasional shared meal and the satisfaction of watching a thing done properly. They began in earnest the following March, when the frost released the ground enough to work. The first task was the drainage tile, 2,200 linear feet of original clay pipe, most of it collapsed or blocked, running in a grid pattern beneath the western third of the parcel. Clara hired 2 men from the county who did excavation work between planting seasons, and she and Theodore walked the grid with a hand-drawn map that Theodore had constructed from memory and from an old county surveyor's document he had obtained from the courthouse records office. They dug, they cleared. They relayed 340 feet of new perforated pipe. They rebuilt the outflow structures at the eastern edge where the tile system connected to the natural drainage corridor that ran toward the river. They worked in cold mud and early spring rain for 6 weeks, and by the end of it, Clara had spent $2,800, and both of her hired men had stopped commenting on the pointlessness of the project, not because they had been persuaded of its merit, but because they had observed that she was not a person who responded well to commentary of that kind. The child appeared in April in the way that overlooked children sometimes appear, quietly, from the direction of nowhere in particular, as though she had been there long enough to have a right to the place. Her name was Imogen. She was 9 years old, and she lived with her grandmother in a small house at the end of a farm track that bisected the upland just north of Clara's rise. Her grandmother was in poor health and largely homebound, and Imogen spent a considerable portion of her days outdoors and unsupervised in the way that children in that particular set of circumstances often do. She had been watching the work from the reed margin for 2 weeks before Clara noticed her. Clara left a sandwich on the fence post, nearest the spot where the girl habitually stood. The next morning, the sandwich was gone, and Imogen was standing 12 feet closer. By the end of the week, she was standing next to Clara at the tile outflow, watching the water move, and the week after that she was handing tools and holding stakes, and performing, with complete seriousness and zero self-consciousness, the role of assistant to a project she understood imperfectly, but committed to absolutely. It was Imogen who named the marsh. She called it the Quiet 40, even though it was 60 acres, because she said the quietest part, the eastern section where the heritage reed grew thickest, was the part that mattered most, and the quiet was the thing that the marsh was trying to keep. Clara did not correct the mathematics. She used the name. By June of the first year, the western section had drained sufficiently to walk without sinking to the knee. The soil that emerged from beneath the reed litter was the color of dark chocolate, and had the particular yielding density of material that had been composting in anaerobic conditions for 3 decades. Clara took a sample to the county extension office, where a young agronomist named Petra, newly posted and not yet fully acquainted with local opinion, ran a proper soil analysis, and came back with numbers that she delivered with visible excitement, and then, seeing Clara's unsurprised expression, with a measure of professional restraint. Nitrogen content well above any topsoil in the county, organic matter at 19%, pH stable at 6.4. Petra said it was some of the finest undisturbed horticultural substrate she had tested in the region, and Clara thanked her and asked her to keep the results on file, which Petra did, and which Clara knew meant they were technically a matter of record without being a matter of common knowledge. She was not ready for the community to know, not yet. There was a particular arithmetic she was working through that had nothing to do with soil chemistry and everything to do with the relationship between being right and being believed. And she understood that in a community that has publicly committed to a verdict, the distance between being right and being believed is longer than any reasonable person would prefer. She kept the soil analysis in a manila folder in the farmhouse. She continued to let the neighbors assume the project was a slow-motion demonstration of expensive futility. She banked her progress like a coal under ash, warm and patient and invisible, and she continued the work. The reed harvest came in September of that first year. Theodore managed it with the precision of someone who had done this work since childhood, selecting by culm diameter and height and flexibility, rejecting anything that did not meet his exacting, privately calibrated standard. They cut and bundled and dried 3,400 individual culms from the eastern section alone. Clara had already made contact, through her old professional network from the Environmental Agency, with a manufacturer of orchestral woodwind instruments located 4 states to the north, and with a traditional building cooperative in the southwest that used heritage reed in climate-appropriate construction. She had sent samples in August. She had received replies that were, in the careful language of professional buyers, evaluating an unknown source, cautiously enthusiastic. In October, she received her first purchase order, 1,200 selected culms at $3.80 per column from the instrument manufacturer, and 800 bundled sections from the building cooperative at a rate that worked out to slightly over $2 per linear foot of usable material. She collected $4,560 from those 2 transactions. She said nothing about it to anyone except Theodore, who received the news with a single nod and the observation that the first water through a cracked vessel is always just a trickle. Then he refilled their cups. The second growing season was when the soil became productive. Clara had prepared 11 acres of the western section through the winter, incorporating the drained muck into managed raised beds, using a technique she had read about in German horticultural literature from the early 20th century and adapted for the specific conditions of the crescent. She planted in April heritage varieties of aquatic root vegetables and marsh herbs, including varieties of watercress, water parsley, and a particular strain of Chinese water chestnut that had been naturalized to cold climate conditions by a university research program whose seed library Clara had corresponded with over the winter. She also planted in the better drained margins 3 acres of specialty cut flowers suited to high organic, moisture-retentive soil, varieties of iris and marsh marigold, and a cultivated form of native blue flag that she had grown from a seed collection maintained by a botanical preservation organization she had been a member of since her agency days. By July, the beds were producing at a rate that would have surprised anyone who understood wetland horticulture, which in Harmon County was essentially no one except Theodore, who did not express surprise because he had expected this outcome and had said so. The cut flowers moved through a specialty growers cooperative that Clara had joined by mail in February, and the root vegetables found buyers through the specialty food distributors who serviced the regional restaurant market 3 hours to the south. The numbers for the second season, counting both the September reed harvest and the summer growing revenue together, came to $14,200 in gross revenue before expenses. After seed costs, labor for the 2 drainage men whom she had retained on a part-time basis for bed preparation, and the cost of the refrigerated transport she was renting twice weekly to move perishables, the net was just under $9,000. She wrote the figure in the ledger and closed it and set it on the shelf above the fireplace in the farmhouse and did not tell anyone. It was around this time, the late summer of the second year, that the county began to notice something had changed at the Low Crescent without being able to articulate exactly what. The reeds that had grown wild and undifferentiated for a generation were now visibly managed, sectioned into harvest corridors with the precision of a planned system. The western edge, which had been a mudflat of stunted sedge as long as anyone could remember, had become something that looked from the county road, like an intentional garden. Imogen, who had become a fixture at the Crescent from the moment school released each day and on weekends from first light, had taken to bringing her grandmother to the fence on days when the older woman felt well enough for the trip, and the grandmother had told two of her neighbors that she did not know exactly what Clara Voss was doing down in that low ground, but that whatever it was smelled extraordinary on a warm morning and looked like nothing she had ever seen in 40 years of living in the county. Aldous Whitmore drove past the Crescent on a Thursday in August of that second year, which Clara knew because Imogen, with the attentiveness of a child whose nervous system is calibrated to notice anything that enters the environment with the frequency of a threat, had seen his truck slow at the fence and told Clara that the big man had sat there for 5 minutes before driving on. Clara had nodded and returned to the bed she was weeding. She was not surprised. She had been expecting Whitmore's attention to arrive approximately around this time, and she had a considered view of what to do when it did. What she did was nothing. Specifically, she did nothing different, said nothing new to anyone, and made no changes to the operations at the Crescent that would suggest she was aware of being observed. She harvested. She sold. She maintained the tile system. She prepared 3 additional acres of the northern margin for a third-season planting of a cold-tolerant water spinach variety she had sourced from a market garden in the Pacific Northwest. She paid her property taxes on both the 12-acre rise and the 60-acre Crescent in full and on time. She was polite to everyone she encountered in town and gave away nothing. The arithmetic continued in the ledger. The autumn of the second year brought the drought. It arrived the way droughts arrive in flat country, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with a slow subtraction of ordinary moisture that at first seems like a dry spell and reveals itself as a catastrophe only when the calendar has moved far enough that there is no recovery possible within the current season. By October, the upland fields in Harmon County were cracking. Burrell's pasture, which required a minimum of 14 inches of warm season rainfall to carry the grass his Herefords depended on, had received 9. The upland row crops that 3 other county farming families had planted in the northern sections had come in at between 30 and 50% of expected yield. The county's primary hay supplier, a third-generation operation on the West Road, had cut its second crop at barely half volume, and its third cut was negligible. And then the fungal blight arrived in December, carried on the dry wind from the southwest, and it moved through the county's stored grain and hay with the indiscriminate efficiency of a thing that has found conditions precisely suited to its nature. The blight took Burrell's hay stores first, then his neighbors, then the grain reserves that 3 families had banked against the thin harvest. It moved building to building, barn to barn, reaching into the county's collective margin of winter safety and extracting from it the arithmetic of several families' survival plans. The county extension office issued advisories. The bank extended several operating lines with language that Garrett the loan officer delivered in a tone carefully calibrated to convey charity without concealing the subtext, which was that the bank's patience had a finite denominator and the families knew it. Clara's Crescent was not affected by the blight. This was not luck. The blight's vector was airborne fungal spore that required the specific dry air, low humidity conditions of the drought-stressed upland to travel and take hold. The Crescent's microclimate, maintained by the active hydrology of the tile system and the evapotranspiration of 60 acres of managed wetland vegetation, had maintained a relative humidity in the 15 to 20% above ambient range throughout the drought period. The blight spores, encountering that humidity boundary at the Crescent's edge, had not prospered. Clara's stored reed harvests, dried and bundled in the well-ventilated barn on the rise, according to Theodore's protocols, were untouched. Moreover, and this was the development that moved through Harmon County in January of the third year, with the particular velocity of news that contradicts a settled conviction, Clara's Crescent had water, not flooded, not drowned, but actively managed at the level that allowed productive horticulture to continue through a drought that had reduced the upland to dust. The tile system that she had spent $2,800 repairing in the cold mud of the first spring was drawing residual groundwater from the clay basin beneath the crescent, at a rate that kept the beds viable. The specialty crops in the western section had yielded through October without interruption. While the upland farmers were calculating what they could not afford to replace, Clara Voss was packing refrigerated transport twice a week and writing numbers in a ledger that had, by December of that year, reached a cumulative net figure of $22,600 above her total investment in the Crescent. Burl came to see her in January. He was not a man who found humility comfortable, and the conversation showed it. He stood at the gate of the rise, hat in hand, and told her that he had heard she might have some feed-quality marsh hay and root waste from the vegetable beds that might be suitable for supplemental feeding, and he wondered what she might take for a quarter-ton. Clara told him she had 2 tons of dried sedge hay from the crescent margins, cut in September at appropriate moisture content, and that she would sell it at market rate for comparable forage quality, which she named as $38 per hundredweight, and that she would also give him first access to the root vegetable processing waste, which was nutritionally dense and which she would include at no additional cost as a gesture of neighborliness. Burl looked at her for a moment and then said that was fair. They shook hands at the gate. 2 other families came in the following week with similar requests. Clara supplied them all at market rate, not below, but without the markup that their circumstances might have supported. She was not in the business of extracting from people's worst moments what the arithmetic of desperation would technically have permitted. She was in the business of building a market that would still be functional when the drought was over, and she understood that the way you treat your neighbors in January when they are frightened is the way your neighbors treat you in May when the season has turned. It was Garrett, the loan officer, who told Aldous Whitmore about the ledger. Clara did not know this with certainty, but she had a considered hypothesis about it, which was that Garrett, who processed Clara's small operating account and, therefore, saw the incoming wire transfers from the instrument manufacturer and the building cooperative and the specialty distributors, had reported the pattern of deposits to Whitmore in the course of one of the routine bank management discussions that community bankers and their primary investors conduct as a matter of ordinary business. Clara did not fault Garrett for this. She had, in fact, expected it. It was among the reasons she had kept her revenue streams structured as they were, visible enough to establish the pattern of success, not yet fully public enough to allow the full picture to be grasped by someone attempting to intercept it. Whitmore came to the Crescent in February. He came alone, without Garrett, which Clara noted. He walked the fence line for 20 minutes before approaching the gate, which Clara also noted. He was wearing the wool coat. He smiled when she met him at the gate, and the smile was the particular variety that powerful men produce when they are performing warmth as a strategic instrument rather than experiencing it as an ordinary human response. He told her he had been following her work with admiration. He told her that the Crescent was looking better than he had ever seen it. He told her that, given the difficult season the county had experienced, he had been thinking about community investment opportunities, and that he had an interest in discussing a partnership arrangement in which the bank would provide operating capital, marketing infrastructure, and, as he put it, the institutional credibility that a sole operator sometimes found it difficult to project in exchange for a 51% stake in the Crescent operation. Clara looked at him across the gate. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "That is a generous offer." He said he thought it was. She said she would think about it and let him know. He left. She watched his truck move up the county road and told Imogen, who had been standing behind the barn wall with the stillness of a small animal that understands the value of invisibility, that she could come out now. Imogen came out. She asked if Clara was going to take the offer. Clara said no. Imogen said good. They went back to the beds. The third full growing season was the one that settled the question. Clara had extended the productive wetland garden to 19 acres of the western and northern sections by May. The heritage reed harvest in September of the third year produced 4,900 culms of the premium grade, for which the instrument manufacturer had by now entered a standing purchase agreement at $4.20 per culm, reflecting both the established quality of Clara's supply and a modest price increase she had negotiated on the basis of 3 consecutive reliable deliveries. The building cooperative had referred her to 2 additional buyers in the traditional construction community, both of whom had placed orders for the following season based on samples. The specialty food operation had expanded its distributor relationships, and the watercress and water chestnut and marsh herb lines were moving through a broader regional market than the original 3-hour transport radius had served. And in October of the third year, Clara had a conversation with Petra, the agronomist from the Extension office, that moved from the professional to the personal and ended with Petra driving out to the Crescent on a Saturday morning and standing at the edge of the northern margin with her hands in the soil and an expression on her face that was not professionally restrained at all, but was the open, undisguised expression of someone seeing a thing they had been hoping for a long time to see. Petra said that what Clara had done with the drainage and the soil management and the heritage planting was a model. She said she had been looking for a local case study for a regional wetland agriculture extension program that she was trying to build, and that she believed the Crescent could serve as the demonstration site, and that if Clara was willing, there was grant funding available through the State Agricultural Department that could support the construction of a small educational facility and the development of a formal cooperative framework through which other county landowners could access the methodology. Clara was willing. She said so. She asked Petra what the grant process looked like and what the timeline was, and Petra said that the formal application period opened in the first week of January, and that she was confident in the application's prospects given the demonstrable results at the Crescent. It was around this time that Whitmore made the error that undid him. He had been attending the county extension monthly meetings, which he did as a matter of civic performance rather than agricultural interest, and at the November meeting he made a comment in the open discussion period that was intended, Clara believed, to position himself as an informed stakeholder in the developing story of the Crescent, before the story became too large to enter cheaply. He said that he had been observing the reed operation at the Low Crescent parcel for the past 2 years, and that he understood the current season's premium grade harvest had run to somewhere in the range of 4,800 culms, which was, he said, a remarkable yield for a parcel everyone had written off. 4,800 culms. The actual number was 4,900. The difference was small. The source of Whitmore's figure was not. Clara had shared the harvest count with 2 people, Theodore and Imogen. She had shared the number with no one at the Extension office, no one at the cooperative, and certainly not with Garrett or the bank. The number 4,800 was close enough to the truth to have come only from someone who had access to the barn records or had conducted a personal count that fell slightly short, and close enough to the true figure to be impossible to attribute to a general community estimate. Whitmore had, in the language of his own confident world, miscounted by 100 culms, and in doing so had revealed that he had been counting at all. Theodore, who had accompanied Clara to the extension meeting because he had an opinion about the proposed cooperative framework that he intended to voice, heard the number and looked at Clara and said nothing. His expression said everything. Clara kept her face still and wrote 4,800 in the margin of her meeting notes and circled it once. She did not look at Whitmore. She continued listening to the discussion. She waited. The County Land Board meeting in the third week of January was the public occasion that settled the accounts. The board had convened to consider the Extension Program's Cooperative Framework application and the proposed designation of the Crescent parcel as a county demonstration site, which carried with it a formal valuation review as required by the grant conditions. 3 independent appraisers had assessed the Crescent on the basis of the documented production history and the soil analysis and the standing purchase agreements, and their consensus valuation of the 60 acres as a productive wetland agriculture operation was $47,000. The original assessed value on the county tax rolls, unchanged since the parcel had first been classified as nuisance land, was $360. Whitmore had sent a letter to the board in advance of the meeting, proposing that the bank, as a community institution with an interest in the county's agricultural development, should be the appropriate vehicle for any capital structuring associated with the new cooperative, and suggesting that the Crescent Operations founder might benefit from professional partnership support in managing the transition to a larger institutional framework. The letter was gracious in its language and had the quality of a document composed by someone who had not yet been told that the ground had already shifted beneath him. Clara spoke for 6 minutes at the meeting. She presented the ledger, 22 months of documented revenue, documented expenses, documented net. She presented the standing purchase agreements. She presented Petra's soil analysis, still in the manila folder, with the date stamp from 2.5 years prior. She presented the appraiser's consensus valuation, and then she read aloud the number that Whitmore had offered at the extension meeting, 4,800 culms, and she read aloud her own certified harvest record, 4,900 culms. And she said in the level, final voice she reserved for sentences that did not require elaboration, that she found it interesting that a person who had never been invited to count her harvest seemed to have arrived at a count very close to the actual figure. There was a silence in that meeting room that had the particular quality of a thing being understood by everyone present simultaneously. Whitmore's face did the color change again. His hands were still. His eyes moved. Clara did not look at him for long. She turned back to the board. She said that she welcomed the cooperative framework and the extension designation, and that she intended to participate fully in the grant application. She said that she had one condition, which was that the operating structure of the cooperative be governed by a board that included the participating landowners, the extension office, and a community representative, and that the financial institution involvement, if any, be limited to a standard depository relationship without equity stake or governance role. The board chairman, a weathered man named Gunderson, who had farmed the same parcel for 40 years and had voted in every county election since he was 18, looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at Clara, and said he thought those terms were entirely reasonable. Whitmore stood before the meeting closed and said that he had always admired Clara's work and that he hoped the community would benefit from her efforts, and his voice had the quality of a man reading from a script he had not had sufficient time to revise. Clara thanked him. She said she hoped the community would benefit also. She said she expected it would. That was the last time Whitmore made a public comment about the Crescent operation. Garrett, the loan officer, processed the extension program's initial grant disbursement when it arrived in April without visible commentary on the irony of handling Clara's banking business with the full institutional service he had previously withheld on the grounds of insufficient collateral. The cooperative took in its first 3 member landowners in the spring of the 4th year. Burrell, who had converted 15 of his marginal low acres to the managed wetland model with Petra's technical assistance. A family named Strickland, who held 40 wet acres on the South Road that they had been unable to crop productively for a decade, and a younger man named Devereaux, who had inherited a small parcel adjacent to the Crescent's eastern margin and who had the combination of energy and attentiveness that suggested he would eventually be very good at this work. Clara helped all of them. She shared the tile repair methodology. She shared Theodore's harvest protocols. She introduced them to the instrument manufacturer and the building cooperative and the specialty food distributor network. She charged none of them for this. The cooperative's founding documents required members to share methodology openly and to price their outputs at agreed market rates, which prevented the kind of internal undercutting that destroys collective enterprises from within. Imogen was 12 by the time the cooperative held its first spring planting day in the Quiet 40, and she had by that point accumulated 3 years of practical wetland horticulture experience that put her in the unusual position of being the most technically knowledgeable 12-year-old within several counties on the subject of heritage reed cultivation and anaerobic soil management. She moved through the planting day with an authority that the new cooperative members recognized and deferred to without quite understanding why, which Theodore observed from his chair at the Crescent's south gate with the expression of a man who has seen this particular unfolding before and finds it entirely satisfactory. Clara had paid $120 for the 60 acres. After 26 months of documented operation, her cumulative net, above all expenses including the initial purchase, was $22,600. The Crescent's appraised value was $47,000. The cooperative's first-year combined gross from the member operations was projected by Petra at $78,000, of which Clara's individual operation represented approximately $31,000. The arithmetic of patience had, as Theodore had indicated it would from the beginning, arrived at a figure that the arithmetic of contempt had not been able to see coming. The evening after the county board meeting, Clara sat on the porch of the farmhouse on the rise with Theodore, and the low ground spread out below them in the particular blue light of a January evening. And the Quiet 40 was dark and still and smelled of cold water and reed damp and the faint organic sweetness of soil that is doing what soil is supposed to do when it is given enough time and the right attention. Theodore had his cup. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The crack in the vessel is not the flaw. It is how the water found its way in." Clara said she had heard that before. He said he expected she had. They sat there until the light was gone and the cold came up from the low ground, and the stars appeared one at a time over the Crescent's eastern edge, above the heritage reed that stood still in the windless air, 12 feet tall and valuable, and full of the slow, patient knowledge of things that have been growing in the dark for 30 years without apology. The next morning Clara opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. The Crescent needed 12 more acres of northern margin prepared before April. The tile system required its spring inspection. She had a standing order to fulfill by the 15th and a new seed delivery arriving on Thursday. Imogen would be there after school. Theodore would come in the afternoon. The work was not done. The work was not the kind that was ever done, not in the sense that a single project concludes and the ledger closes. It was the other kind, the kind that continues because it has become the shape of a life and because the life has found, in the continuing, the particular equilibrium that is worth more than any settlement and lasts longer than any insult. She wrote the first figure on the fresh page. Outside, the reed marsh exhaled its cold morning breath into the January air, and the tile water moved in its channels through the dark soil, and the 60 acres that a county had called worthless for 11 years held their ground in the way that things built on patience and purpose always do, quietly, without announcement, with the unshakable arithmetic of worth.